sitting at my kitchen table in Tucson when it happened. My hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and my husband of 3 years was standing by the window with his back to me. And he said, out loud, in a clear, steady voice I had never heard before, "Elaine, we need to talk." I dropped the mug. Not because of what he said. People say we need to talk every day. I dropped it because my husband had never spoken a single word to me in the 3 years we had been married. Not one word. Not ever. Because my husband was deaf. Or so I had believed. Let me back up. Because to understand what happened that Tuesday morning, you have to understand where I was before I met him. And I don't mean geographically. I mean the particular kind of tired that settles into your bones when you have spent 62 years doing everything right and still find yourself eating dinner alone. I was 62 when we met. I had retired 18 months earlier from 30 years of nursing, cardiac ICU, which is not a gentle job. It takes something from you every year, a little piece at a time, until one day you look in the mirror and realize you are made mostly of competence and very little else. My marriage, my first marriage, had ended when I was 54, not dramatically, not with affairs or shouting. It just ran out, the way a river sometimes does in dry country. My ex-husband and I had grown so far apart that divorce felt less like a rupture and more like acknowledging something that had already happened years before. My daughter Patrice lived in Portland. She called every Sunday and worried about me in that particular way. Adult children worry about their parents. Not enough to come visit often, but enough to mention it frequently. My son Russell was in Atlanta with his wife and their 3 kids. He called less often, but meant it more when he did. I had my garden. I had my book club. I had my 2 cats, Marble and Fig. I told myself I was content. I was lying. I met Leonard at a community art class, one of those watercolor evenings at the Tucson Museum of Art that they hold on Thursday nights for people who want something to do with their hands besides scroll through their phones. I had signed up on a whim after Patrice suggested it, mostly to get her to stop suggesting things. He was sitting 2 seats down from me, a tall man with silver hair and very careful hands, and he was working on a painting of the Santa Catalina Mountains with the kind of focused quiet that I found immediately interesting. When the instructor came by to comment on his work, he tilted his head at an angle and waited, and then the instructor wrote something on a small notepad she kept clipped to her apron. He read it, nodded, smiled. I watched that exchange and felt something shift in my chest. Not pity. I want to be clear about that. I am a nurse of 30 years. I do not pity people for having bodies that work differently from others. What I felt was something closer to recognition. Here was a person who had figured out how to be fully present in a world that wasn't built for him. His name was Leonard Marsh. He was 68 years old. He had made his money in commercial real estate. Not the glamorous Silicon Valley kind, but the steady, practical kind. Strip malls and medical office buildings in the Southwest. Not flashy. Reliable. He had lost his hearing in his early 50s, he told me through his phone's notepad app, as a complication from a medication he'd been given after a procedure. Sudden sensory neural hearing loss, it was called. There was a surgery attempted. It didn't work. By 53, he was profoundly deaf. His late wife had left him 2 years after the diagnosis. That detail he shared with a quietness that told me he had made his peace with it, mostly. We communicated by typing on our phones that first night, passing them back and forth across the work table while our watercolors dried. It was slow and a little clumsy and entirely wonderful. There is something about having to choose your words carefully, having to type them out, that strips away all the filler. No and and anyway, just what you actually mean. By the time the class ended, I had already agreed to have coffee with him the following Saturday. I need to say something here, because I know what some people assume, and I would rather address it plainly. I was not interested in Leonard because of his money. I found out about the extent of his financial situation much later, and honestly, it complicated things more than it helped. I was interested in him because he listened, really listened, in the way that people who cannot hear sometimes do better than people who can. He read every word I typed with his full attention. He responded thoughtfully. He never once made me feel like a burden or a distraction. I had not felt that in a very long time. We dated for 14 months. In that time, I learned to communicate with him in the ways that worked. I took an ASL class at the community college level 1, then level 2. I got reasonably good at it, not fluent, but enough that we could have real conversations without always reaching for our phones. I learned the particular rhythms of his silences. I learned that he laughed with his whole face. I learned that he made the best green chili stew I had ever eaten in my life, and he made it every Sunday in the fall, and the smell of it became, for me, the smell of being safe. When he proposed, I said yes before he had finished signing the question. We got married in April. Small ceremony, my kids there, his son Theodore from his first marriage, a few close friends. It was a genuinely happy day. I remember standing in the courtyard of the little hotel where we had the reception, holding his hand and thinking, I did not know it could still feel like this. I genuinely did not know. We settled into his house in the Catalina foothills, a beautiful adobe place with a view of the mountains and a garden that I immediately took over. We had a routine, morning coffee on the back patio. He read the paper on his tablet. I tended the rosemary. In the evenings we cooked together or we drove out to the desert to watch the sun go down. We communicated in our mix of ASL and typed messages, and the kind of shorthand that couples develop without realizing they're developing it. I was happy, not performing happiness, actually happy. And then there was that Tuesday morning, 14 months into our marriage, when I was sitting at the kitchen table, and my husband turned from the window and he spoke. Elaine, we need to talk. 6 words, clear as water. The voice of a 68-year-old man with a slight roughness to it, the way voices get when they haven't been used regularly in years, but perfectly intelligible, perfectly coherent. I stared at him. He pulled out a chair across from me and sat down. He was not signing. He was not reaching for his phone. He folded his hands on the table, and he looked at me, and he said, I owe you the truth. I have owed it to you for a long time, and I am sorry I didn't find a way to give it to you sooner. I think I said, what? Just the word, flat, no inflection. I'm not sure. I remember the room felt very bright and very still. He took a breath, and then he told me. He was not deaf. He had never been deaf. The story about the medication, the failed surgery, the progressive hearing loss, none of it was true. He had been researching and rehearsing it for so long that he could recite it perfectly, and he had. To me, to everyone. He had lost his first wife, he said, not to his disability, but to a moment of honesty that destroyed everything. He had been struggling quietly for years with severe anxiety and what he now understood to be a dissociative disorder. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible from the outside. But in his 50s, it had gotten bad enough that he had entered a psychiatric program and spent 3 months inpatient, something his wife had not known the full extent of until it was unavoidable. And when she found out, not about the condition, but about the secrecy, she had left. She told him she could not trust a man who had hidden something that significant from her. She said she did not know who she had actually married. He never fully recovered from that. Not the illness. He managed that over time, with the right help. But the fear that if someone truly knew him, knew the interior of him, they would leave. He had watched his wife walk out on the fact of his secrecy alone, not even on the illness itself, and something in him had calcified around that. So he had constructed Leonard Marsh, the deaf man, a person whose silence was explained. A person who had a reason, a visible, understandable, sympathetic reason, for not fully communicating, for the gaps, for the moments when he retreated. A person who could love someone and be loved and never have to explain the dark room at the center of himself. Because the dark room had a different name now. It was called deafness. People nodded. People understood. He had been doing it for 9 years. I sat across from him, and I did not say anything for a very long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in those minutes, because I think it matters. I am 62 years old. I am not a young woman who mistakes the feeling of shock for the feeling of heartbreak and doesn't know the difference. I knew the difference. What I felt in the first minutes was shock, pure, cold, disorienting shock. And underneath it, before any anger came, before any grief came, was something that I think surprised me more than anything he had just said. I felt like I recognized it. I am a cardiac nurse. I have sat with more people in crisis than most people will in 10 lifetimes. I know what it looks like when someone builds a wall not out of cruelty but out of survival. I know the difference between deception as a weapon and deception as a shelter. I did not excuse what he had done in those first minutes, but I understood its shape. Then the anger came. I asked him to leave. Not dramatically. I told him I needed him to go stay somewhere else for a while so I could think, and he nodded, and he went. He called Theodore, who lived 40 minutes away in Marana, and went to stay with him. I called Patrice that night. She was furious in the way that children are furious on behalf of their parents. Immediately, completely, without the complication of also loving the person who had done the harm. She wanted me to call a lawyer the next morning. Russell was quieter. He asked me what I wanted to do. That question, the simplicity of it, was the thing that finally made me cry. I did not know what I wanted to do. What I did was call my own therapist. I had been seeing a therapist since my divorce, not constantly, but as needed, the way you see a doctor for maintenance and not only for emergencies. She had an opening the next afternoon. I took it. I will not pretend she solved anything in one session. She didn't, but she asked me something that stayed with me. She said, when you think back on your marriage to Leonard, the actual experience of it, not what you now know about the terms under which it was built, what do you find? I thought about that for a long time. What I found was I had not been deceived about the experience. I had been deceived about the explanation. Leonard had genuinely listened to me. He had genuinely made room for me in his life. The love, such as it was, had not been performed. The Sunday stew, the evenings watching the desert go dark, the way he touched my hand when I talked about my years in the ICU, as though he understood the weight I had carried in those rooms. None of that was fiction. But the structure it was built on, the premise that I had knowingly entered into, that was. And I had given things up based on that premise. I had adjusted the way I communicated for 14 months of dating and then 14 months of marriage. I had spent real money on ASL classes. I had developed habits, patterns, workarounds. I had loved a man I understood to be deaf, and there was a version of that love that did not transfer cleanly to the man sitting across from me who had been hearing every word I ever said. That was the part that felt strange and hollow in a way that was hard to articulate. Not betrayal exactly, more like vertigo. He wrote me a letter, not a text, a handwritten letter. 5 pages, his handwriting small and careful. I read it 4 times over 2 days. In it he explained in the detail that he could not manage spoken, the full history of it, the anxiety disorder, the hospitalization, the deterioration of his first marriage. The particular moment he had decided to build the deception, not as a plan he hatched and refined, but as a thing that happened gradually, almost accidentally, the way bad decisions so often do. He had mentioned early in his re-entry into dating that he had some hearing issues. It had gotten a response of such immediate warmth that he had let it grow. By the time it had grown into a full identity, he was too far in to know how to get out. He said he had come close to telling me 6 times. He described each of those moments in the letter, the specific day, what we were doing, what stopped him. Twice it was fear. Once it was a stupid argument we'd had the week before, and he'd told himself the timing was wrong. Once was the morning of our wedding, when he had woken up and nearly called the whole thing off, and then talked himself into the idea that he would tell me on the honeymoon and hadn't. He ended the letter by saying, "I do not ask you to forgive me. I only want you to know that you were the first person since my divorce who made me feel like the truth might be safe. I am sorry it took me this long to test that." I held the letter in my garden, next to the rosemary, and I cried. Not for the first time that week, but differently than the other times. I did not call him for 3 weeks. He did not call me. We had agreed to that. At the end of the 3 weeks, I called him and asked if he wanted to meet for coffee. Not at home. Neutral ground. The same coffee shop near the art museum where we'd had our first date after the watercolor class. He came in looking like he had not slept well in 21 days, which he probably hadn't. We sat across from each other, and I looked at him, the real him, the version I was still figuring out how to see, and I said, "I need you to see a therapist, not couples therapy yet. Your own therapist, regularly, for as long as it takes." He said he already had. He had made an appointment the day after he left the house. I nodded. I said, "I need you to understand that I may never fully get over this. I may carry some version of it for the rest of my life, and I need you to not be defensive about that. When it surfaces, I need to be able to say it out loud without you shutting down." He said he understood. I said, "I also need you to understand that what you were hiding from, the diagnosis, the hospitalization, the fear about it, I would not have run from that. I am a nurse. I spent 30 years with people in the worst moments of their lives. There is nothing in what you just described to me that would have made me love you less. That is the part I am most angry about. Not that you had something to hide, but that you didn't trust me enough to find out." He looked down at his hands and then back up at me, and he said, "I know." Those 2 words, in his actual voice, for the first time, not on a phone screen, not in ASL, but just his voice saying "I know," were somehow the hardest and the most honest thing I had heard in the entire 3 weeks. We went to couples therapy for 4 months. Our therapist was a woman in her 50s who did not let either of us hide, which I respected enormously. She made Leonard articulate, out loud, the specific fears that had driven the deception. She made me articulate the grief I was carrying. Not just for the lie, but for the version of Leonard I thought I had known, and the loss of certainty that came with it. It was not comfortable work. There were sessions where I drove home crying and sat in the car in the garage for a while before I could go inside. There were sessions where I wasn't sure we were going to make it through this, and I said so. Our therapist did not reassure me falsely. She said, "That is an honest place to be right now. Stay in it." We did. I am not going to tell you that everything is perfectly fine now. I am 64. I have been around long enough to know that perfectly fine is mostly a story people tell themselves, and the actual texture of a good life is more complicated and more interesting than that. What I will tell you is that Leonard and I are still married. He continues to see his therapist every 2 weeks. We have had, in the 18 months since that Tuesday morning, more genuinely honest conversations than we had in the 3 years before it. He talks more now, actually talks with his voice, and I have noticed things about the way he speaks that I find I love. The particular way he phrases a question, the way he pauses before he says something he's thought carefully about. There are still days when I set a cup of coffee down in front of him and he says, "Thank you." And I hear his voice, and something in me goes sideways for just a second. Not anger exactly. Something quieter. A small ghost of the version of this life I thought I was living. I let it pass. It passes. Last spring, Theodore got married, his son, and at the reception, Leonard gave a toast. He stood up in front of maybe 80 people, and he spoke. His voice was a little rough, still, from years of disuse. But he spoke clearly, and he was funny, and he said something about how his son had found a partner who made him want to be more honest than he had ever been before. And I watched Leonard's face while he said it, and I knew it was about more than Theodore. My daughter still has complicated feelings about all of this. She and I have talked about it many times, and I think she will come around eventually in her own time. My son Russell shook Leonard's hand the last time they saw each other, and that was for Russell a fairly complete statement of where he stood. I tend the garden. The rosemary is enormous now. Marble the cat has decided that Leonard is her person, which I think is just, in its way. I have thought a great deal about what I would say if someone asked me whether they should stay with a partner who had deceived them the way Leonard deceived me. And the honest answer is, I don't know. I don't know because it depends on things that are not transferable from one life to another. It depends on the nature of the deception and what it cost you and what the person has done since. It depends on who you are and how much you have left to give and what you believe about whether people can change. Not in the abstract, but this specific person in this specific life. What I know is this. I am a nurse. I have held the hands of people dying of things they waited too long to say out loud. I have stood in ICU rooms at 2 in the morning with families who would have given anything for one more honest conversation. I chose to stay. Not because the lie was small. It wasn't. Not because what he did was acceptable. It wasn't. But because when I asked myself what I would regret more, at the end of all of this, I knew the answer. Leonard is in the kitchen right now. I can hear him moving around in there. The particular sound of him. He is making the green chili stew. It is October, and the light is going gold on the mountains, and in a little while we will sit on the back patio and watch it fade. And he will reach over and take my hand, and I will let him. That is where we are. That is what I chose. I am 64 years old, and I am still learning that love is not a thing you find already made. It is a thing you make, over and over, on ordinary Tuesdays with the actual person in front of you. Not the one you thought you knew, but the one who is really there. I have thought about cause and effect a lot since that Tuesday morning in my kitchen. Not in any grand cosmic sense. I'm too old and too practical for that. But in the specific, honest sense of every choice in this story, his and mine, led somewhere, and the somewhere it led was real, and we both had to live in it. Leonard made a decision 9 years before he met me. He made it out of fear, and fear is not an excuse, but it is an explanation worth taking seriously. He had been honest once about something vulnerable and true, and he had watched the person he loved most use that honesty as a reason to leave. So he stopped being honest. He built something he could control, and for 9 years it worked, until it didn't. Until the weight of it was heavier than the fear of telling the truth. That is what I mean by cause and effect. Not punishment. Not reward, just consequence. The long, slow consequence of choosing protection over connection, and what that costs you over time. I am not without my own accounting in this. I have sat with that too. I fell in love with a man I had partially constructed in my own mind, the stoic, dignified widower navigating a silent world with such grace. There was something comfortable about a man whose silence had an explanation. I did not have to wonder what he was withholding. I thought I already knew. That is its own kind of laziness, and I say that without cruelty toward myself, only with honesty. What I have learned, and I use that word carefully, because real learning is not a tidy moment, it is a slow accumulation, is that the people who deceive us are rarely doing it to us. They are doing it for themselves, around a wound we never got to see. That does not make it acceptable, but it changes what the response needs to be if you decide there is going to be a response at all. The moral question I keep returning to is not whether Leonard was wrong. He was. It is whether I was willing to look at the actual man, the full one, and decide from there. Not the man I had loved. Not the man I had believed I was building a life with. The man who was actually sitting across from me at that coffee shop table, tired and frightened and more honest in that moment than he had been in 9 years. That required something of me. It required me to set aside my own narrative, the wronged woman, the trusting fool, and ask a harder question. What is this person capable of now? Not then. Now. Elaine at 30 would not have been able to do that. Elaine at 40, maybe not either. It took 62 years and 3 decades of sitting with people in the worst moments of their lives to understand that integrity is not the absence of failure. It is what you do after the failure. It is whether you can look at the damage you caused and stay in the room with it instead of walking away. Leonard stayed in the room. That mattered to me. I am not telling anyone to forgive what has been done to them. I am only saying that the most intelligent thing I have ever done, not the most comfortable, not the easiest, but the most intelligent, was refusing to make a permanent decision from inside a temporary state of pain. I waited. I went to therapy. I read his letter 4 times. I sat in my garden and I let the rosemary smell like itself, and I thought carefully about what I actually believed, separate from what I felt. That is what I would pass on to anyone who asked. Not stay or leave. Just think carefully. Feel what you feel, and then think carefully. The two are not the same, and knowing the difference is one of the only things that gets easier with age.